I'm going to say something that maybe you'll use in a future video. Are you going to do a video on In the Court of the Crimson King?
Literally, yes.
Hi, I'm Abby. I have a lot of records, and this is Vinyl Monday. So welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the series where once a week I sit down and just talk about a classic album I love. If 30-minute episodes aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds, both here on my channel and over on my Instagram. This is part 2 of my 3-part 1969 mini-series where I'm spotlighting 3 massively influential records all released within 6 weeks of each other in the fall of '69. I believe all 3 of these records would in some way dictate how rock and roll in the 70s would go. Part 1 was the Beatles' swan song, Abbey Road. This week I'm covering one of the most requested albums ever to have on Vinyl Monday. I'm not kidding when I say I got a comment maybe once a week requesting this one for the entire time I've been doing this. And I finally get to talk about it. This week's album is In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. Congrats to those who guessed this one. Remember, if you want to play along, all you gotta do is check out my community tab. That's where I post my hints to what albums I'll be covering next week. I host polls over there. You can find that on my channel. Alright, let's take the plastic off. So my copy is an early US reissue. This was the second run from 1969. You'll be paying a lot of money for an original in this condition, like, oh my god, and there's a reason for that. In this good of condition, this copy probably would have set me back like $40 in 2019. Had I not gotten it for free. I tell any King Crimson person that I inherited all of my King Crimson for free. They all want to lunge across the table and slap me. In back-to-back episodes now, we've had 2 of my all-time favorite album covers. This one being my very favorite. It strikes the perfect balance between whimsy and uncanny, and it captured the fantastical elements and existential horror of this album's content perfectly. The Crimson King album art was painted by Barry Godber, a friend of the band's. Peter Sinfield just told Barry to paint something cool, something that would get noticed in a record store, and this was the only art that was ever considered for this cover. Greg Lake's account describes all of the guys standing around this painting like it was a box of treasure. He said, "This fucking face screamed up at us from the floor. Gotta love a well-placed swear." And what it said to us was Schizoid Man. Coincidentally enough, that was the track they'd cut that day. Here on the front, we have the Schizoid Man himself, and if you open up the gatefold this way, I'm gonna have B-roll Abby do it because it's just way too much for this. When you open up the gatefold, you get the whole painting, a very frightened humanoid thing with a mega ear. And I can't help but wonder, could this be a reference to the ear of a musician? Things to think about. And on the inside gatefold, next to the lyrics and the liner notes, we have the Crimson King. Is he happy? Is he sad? Is he zooted beyond this mortal plane? Your guess is as good as mine. I mean, his eyes are really red. He's got this dopey smile on his face. I think you know what I think. For a long time, the OG records hung in EG Records' HQ. Robert Fripp owns them now. He has them stowed away and preserved. On In the Court of the Crimson King, we have the inaugural lineup of King Crimson. We have Greg Lake on lead vocals and bass, Robert Fripp on guitar, Ian MacDonald on every instrument under the fucking sun, including but not limited to flute, sax, clarinet, piano, Hammond organ, mellotron, vibraphone, and sharing lead vocals with Greg on I Talk to the Wind. We have Michael Giles on drums, various percussion and backing vocals, and Peter Sinfield serving as principal lyricist. In the Court of the Crimson King was produced by King Crimson themselves, with Robin Thompson and Tony Page engineering. Roll transition. One big note I want to make before we go any further. Here on Vinyl Monday, I usually use samples from the songs I'm talking about to illustrate my points to you. By nature of who made this album and how much of a notorious copyright/fair use bully he is, I might not be able to do that. I won't know until I try to post it, you won't know until you watch it. Let's just get right into the backstory. King Crimson has one of the longest, most complex, mercurial, and fascinating histories of any band in rock and roll. Our story today begins with a group called Giles, Giles, and Fripp. This group consisted of brothers Peter and Michael Giles on vocals/bass and drums respectively, as well as Robert Fripp on guitar. This group formed after the Giles brothers put out an ad in the paper for a keyboardist who could also sing. Robert Fripp responded. At the time, he could not play the keys, and he could not sing. The group really didn't do much. They put out one studio LP, they were Al Stewart's backing band on the BBC one time, but in this period, the trio recruited multi-instrumentalist Ian MacDonald to play the flute. I do not own the Bronsbury tapes. Most people do not own the Bronsbury tapes. The Bronsbury tapes are very hard to find. That being said, I know one person who owns a copy of the Bronsbury tapes. It's just as hard to find floating around on the internet. It seems Fripp has kept a very tight hold on the Giles, Giles, and Fripp stuff for some reason. One can only hope it's for a box set. This compilation is very important to our story today because it has two early versions of I Talk to the Wind. Peter Giles leaves GGNP and McD, I guess, in the fall of '68, leaving this trio without a bassist or a vocalist. This guy, Greg Lake, had been hopping around several bands, most recently a stint with The Gods in London. Kick-ass band name, by the way. Fripp hears Greg can sing and recruits him to replace Peter. Somewhere along the way, the guys also link up with poet Peter Sinfield. Seeing as there was clearly no use for them to be called Giles, Giles, and Fripp anymore, the guys put Sinfield on the spot for a new name. In his words, literally anything was better than Giles, Giles, and Fripp. He panics, spits out the first two words he can think of that sound remotely good together, and the original lineup of King Crimson is born. Fripp said the first 9 or 10 days of this lineup were getting to know each other, feeling each other out as musicians. What do you listen to? How do you play? How do we fit together? The next 9 or 10 days, the tone shifts. There was very much a sense of this is a group which will speak to its own voice without any compromise whatsoever. They found that all the moving parts fit together perfectly. Forgot to grab my umagumma. Since when do I ever talk about umagumma? And my umagumma was upside down. Wow, 2-for-1 deal. You have to remember that progressive rock is still in its infancy in early '69. Pink Floyd is in the middle of a 4-year noodling period right now, still trying to find their footing after the departure of Syd Barrett. Where the hell is my blue cheer? LMNOPQR. The hell would it be? Oh, it would be wedged way in here. Ugh. Genesis hasn't gone prog yet. Yes hasn't put out their first album, but theirs will beat King Crimson's by about a month or so. We're also still years out from the advent of heavy metal. Blue Cheer hasn't quite gotten heavy enough for this title, if you ask me, and Power of Zeus and Black Sabbath won't debut for another year. After months of rehearsing, King Crimson makes their debut in April of 1969. They garnered a small following, earning respect by stunning the crowds at the clubs they'd play into silence. Sinfield's light show was cool too, I guess. I wasn't alive to see it, so clearly I wouldn't know. The forward thinkers of the music scene especially appreciated what King Crimson was doing. This included the inner circles of The Who and the Rolling Stones. Their paths would cross in July of '69. On the 3rd of that month, one of the most forward-thinking guys in this scene, Rolling Stones founder Brian Jones, dies. The Stones put on a free concert on the 5th in Hyde Park as a public memorial for Brian. Hearing about KC through word of mouth from these club gigs, the Stones asked them to open. The 250,000-strong crowd was not stunned into silence that day. They erupted in applause at what they heard. Here was King Crimson's breakthrough. They played this show smack in the middle of recording their debut album at Wessex Sound Studios in London. Sessions took place from June through August. Hallmarks of this era of KC include some wacky time signatures and use of the mellotron. Fripp & Co. would write all their music in 4/4 time and then elaborate it from there. They'd reevaluate and ask, oh, let's do a waltz time here, or this sounds much more natural in 6/8 over there. It wasn't for the sake of showboating for the listeners. It was to challenge and fulfill themselves as musicians. It also left room for improvisation, central to the jazz the guys were listening to. As for the mellotron, Fripp was paying attention to what the Moody Blues were doing at the time. King Crimson would rehearse from 6 to 10 at night most nights, finding the twilight hours into the nighttime most inspiring. That's how we get the flitting, firefly-like moonchild. Whoops! Uh-oh, we're about to release this album and our tape is fucked! The tape wasn't aligned right in the machine for the process, meaning the sound was distorted and all the very highest frequencies, think the very tops of cymbal sounds, were lost, as was whoever's job it was to manage this project, I'm sure. Before release, the engineers and label had a really hard decision to make. Do we send this thing out as is, saving money, but putting out a product that isn't at all how the band intended? Do we attempt to restore this thing, but potentially lose a lot of money on a brand new band that we might not make back? Or do we copy the master tapes to get a closer tone to what King Crimson recorded? However, we're sacrificing the fidelity of sound. There really wasn't a good decision to make in this scenario, so they went with what they felt was the least bad option. That was number 3. Remember when I said my copy was from the second US run? That means that my copy, and all of the others after it until like 2010, didn't come from the original masters. They came from this second-gen tape. Why did it take so long for this thing to be remastered? Oh, we'll get to that! But before then, the In the Court of the Crimson King track listing goes as follows. This might be the shortest this segment will ever be. Opening up side 1, we have 21st Century Schizoid Man with Mirrors. Then I Talk to the Wind, and side 1 closes with Epitaph with March for No Reason and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. Opening up side 2, we have Moonchild with The Dream and The Illusion, and the album closes with In the Court of the Crimson King with Return of the Fire Witch. In the Court of the Crimson King was released on October 10th, 1969. Keep in mind what I said about prog still being in its infancy. It'll make this album breaking the top 5 in the UK and the top 40 in the US all the more remarkable. King Crimson tours the US and UK through late '69. Their opening act was The Nice, and Greg Lake starts hanging out with their keyboardist, Keith Emerson. This lineup of King Crimson did not last long after this album at all. Ian MacDonald was the first to jump ship pretty much right after the tour, with Greg Lake soon to follow. Ian goes on to form Foreigner, while Greg links up with his new bestie Keith and an ex-member of the Crazy World of Arthur Brown to form Emerson, Lake, and fucking Palmer! Peter Giles comes back to replace Greg Lake in 1970, but that's when Michael Giles leaves, so we're in a really interesting spot here. Within a year of King Crimson's debut album, the only original remaining member of King Crimson is Robert Fripp. Thus begins a long history of King Crimson splintering off to form other groups, just as King Crimson itself was an evolution of Giles, and Fripp. Also in 1970, the artist of this cover, Barry Godbird, dies at just 24 years old. To put this in perspective for you, viewer, I'm 24 years old. The Crimson King art was the only album art Barry ever got to make. If he had this much in him so soon, I wonder what other works he could have done had he lived longer. Let's lighten the mood with some dumb shit. Remember the accident in the mastering process? Usually you'd just be able to make a remaster from the master tapes to fix that issue, but for a really, really long time, there wasn't a remaster to fix it. Because some headass at the label lost the masters to In the Court of the Crimson King for over 30 years! You can't make this shit up! In my mind, it's the same guy that didn't align the tape right, he was on a 3-strike system, and this was his strike 2. I don't think I want to know what his strike 3 was. Despite the bumps in the road, Crimson King ended up being one of the most influential prog rock records ever released, though there were other groups progging and putting out LPs at the same time, the Moody Blues, for instance. This is the first prog record as a lot of us know the genre. From the mid-2000s through the 2010s, music sites and forums 4chan allowed Crimson King to reach a new generation of listeners. Now, Fripp seems to really not like King Crimson being a meme. He's infamous among us younger fans for being a copyright bully, for taking down anything and everything that samples King Crimson. Until its 50th anniversary, you could not stream In the Court of the Crimson King or any of King Crimson's music on a streaming service. He'd strike down any and every appearance of Crimson King to the point at which I had to resort to listening to this thing on SoundCloud. SoundCloud! Do you have any idea how bad things have to be to go to SoundCloud? It's a miracle the trombone champ playthrough of 21st Century Schizoid Man has stayed on YouTube for as long as it has. Long may it rain. Aside from the memes, this thing has incredible modern staying power. Writer-director Vincent Gallo directed Christina Ricci in his 1998 film Buffalo 66. In this film, her character Layla... What? Has a dance scene set to Moonchild. After upstaging America's sweetheart Taylor Swift at her VMA's acceptance speech, becoming one of the most hated men in the country in the process, Kanye West puts out his comeback record, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. It's a larger-than-life affair the whole way through, heavily influenced by late 60s and early 70s rock and roll. Through that album's single Power, even more listeners, myself included, were first exposed to King Crimson. And in 2021, UK neo-prog group Black Midi released their cover of 21st Century Schizoid Man on a Cavil Covers EP to support their record Cavalcade. It is a genuinely amazing cover. and B, kind of hilarious. These guys take the piss out of Robert Fripp in the best way. If you're a prog head and you somehow haven't heard Cavalcade or Hellfire, please fix that. Crimson King has had incredible longevity among music fan circles. It's become somewhat of a meme, not unlike In the Aeroplane Over the Sea. So, considering my penchant for meme records, what do I think of Crimson King? So going in, I have an interesting perspective as a Zoomer fan. I was first exposed to King Crimson through the Kanye song. In 2019, I got an entire record collection for free. I've told the story a few times now. And I was looking through albums, deciding which to keep and which to get rid of. And I saw this art. I had no clue what this was, but I was instantly hooked. Whatever this was, it had to be amazing. I tried searching it up on streaming services, but surprise, surprise, it was 2019. It wasn't available there yet. So I put it on my turntable. I received an onslaught of sound, a relatively short but nonetheless wild body of work that I was afraid to engage with in depth. Since then, of the King Crimson that I've dipped my toe into, Islands has become most dear to me, while Lark's Tongues continues to challenge and even intimidate me. Now, before I do my track-by-track breakdown of Crimson King, I have a question that I want to lob up in the air for you. A question I've contemplated myself, and I still don't have an answer to. Is it possible that Robert Fripp's obsession with changeability may have hindered his group? On one hand, you have Court, revolutionary upon release, still incendiary today, followed by In Wake of Poseidon. It was bizarre. It alienated nearly all of the fans they'd garnered with this album. I congratulate King Crimson for taking a huge risk like that, that which took them out of the mainstream in one fell swoop. Maybe that's what Fripp intended. But you have to remember, this challenging body of work happened because of a radical change in lineup. The darker In Wake of Poseidon material was the reason Ian left the group. Fripp's feverish pursuit of metamorphosis alienated some of the greatest talent King Crimson ever saw and caused them to leave. When examining the question from this angle, you can't help but wonder if maybe some potential was lost. Would I want another In the Court of the Crimson King? Hell no. But would I want to see how this lineup moved forward after? Yes. I also want to make note of why it took so long for me to get to covering this album. This is some really, really technical stuff. Prog is technical. That is really hard to break down when you're not a musician. I'm not a musician, so I'll be completely honest with you, I'm probably going to miss some stuff. Though it's a single LP, Crimson King is a haul. The shortest song on here is 6 minutes, so if you're new to prog, pack your patience. But you might find you didn't need to. Greg Lake's voice was sexy and I'm tired of pretending it wasn't! But now that I've heard the Black MIDI cover of this song, I can't unhear Jordy Greep's goofy ass. This thing throws you into the deep end. This is the densest, most dizzying, and heaviest the record will get, and it's only track 1. And the central movement does sound like a prelude to heavy metal. Darth Vader drops in for a feature. The crash cymbal, I think, is manipulated to sound like labored breathing through a gas mask. It's tantamount to this song's atmosphere. A phrase like paranoia's poison door could be interpreted a lot of different ways, but once you contextualize it with blood rack, barbed wire, politician's funeral pyre, and a mention of napalm, this couldn't be much more obvious of a Vietnam song. Our schizoid man here is a soldier suffering from PTSD. The paranoia poison door leads to his memories. There's one thing about this song that throws me off, and once I heard it here, I could not unhear it for the rest of the album. The drums are compressed as hell. There's no high or low frequencies. It's just this flat hit on Giles's snare. As unorthodox as it is, it was smart. There's already so much going on here. Saxophone shrieks, guitars wailing, the drum fills are just inhuman. Having really robust drums on this song would totally wash out Greg's bass. Literally everyone is soloing through the middle movement, but it's kind of like when I listen to Cream and everyone's soloing at the same time. You could listen to 21st Century Schizoid Man 4 or 5 times, focus on a different instrument every time, and it locks together. Learning that all of this was played by one guy, all of this was Ian. Ian did all of this. Ian McDonald did all of this. That man was a god! I need somebody to make an In the Court of the Crimson King, but it's just my voice video purely for this song. I Talk to the Wind. Christ, these song titles are long. You should see my notes right now. It's like I'm writing in code. This is the jazziest we get. It's some of the best flute I've heard on any record, and am I wrong to think this is almost choral in structure? You could transpose this very easily into a cappella vocals and not lose much. This song weaves beautifully in and out of itself. If Father God Fripp won't smite me, this is my favorite moment. The drums on Epitaph are huge. This song and I Talk to the Wind are the exceptions to that flatness that I pointed out earlier. The instrumentation is lofty and huge like a cathedral. God, that bass clarinet! Or whatever it is. This was the song that made me notice the lyrics, and then I had to go back for them in every other song. That's what you get when you have a literal, actual poet writing for you, I guess. The fate of all mankind I see is in the hands of fools, and if we make it, we can all sit back and laugh, but I fear tomorrow I'll be crying. This is the sense of dread that underscored the late 60s. Last week with Abbey Road, we talked about the optimism. This is the opposite. Part of why so much crazy shit went down in the 60s, part of why people got so radical, had the guts to, really, was because everyone thought we'd be nuked into oblivion. We'll all be a cinder block flying through space soon anyway. Why not go out with a bang? I'm just gonna call this section the genius of Moonchild, but before we get there, I have a quick note to make. This one is a little uncanny for me. My grandma's nickname for me is Moonchild. I promise you, she has no clue who King Crimson was. That was like a country household. And she had a weeping willow in the garden of the house my mom grew up in. I spent a pretty decent chunk of my childhood there too. I've told plenty of tales of being a strange, morose, by all accounts feral child who played in the trees, and it just keeps coming back in ways that I don't expect. The first movement, the famous one from Buffalo 66, that's a medieval dance with those drum taps. A common critique of this song is, did it really have to be 10 minutes long? There's 8 minutes of instrumental ambient noodling that feels like it goes nowhere, but I'm here to tell you, yes, Moonchild did have to be 10 minutes. And that's not just because it's an exercise in King Crimson's more free-form jazz side. I was walking my dog one day when I got to that quiet part of Moonchild. I heard the breeze. I heard someone mowing their lawn in the distance. I heard my dog's tags and our steps on the ground. Moonchild will be different every time you listen to it, because there will always be different ambient noises filling that silence. Unless you're a fucking freak with a soundproof room, but even then, you'll be sniffling or shuffling in your seat. It's like going to the orchestra and hearing that John Cage piece, 433. 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, but it never is. You will never hear the same moonchild twice. And finally, in the court of the Crimson King, oh, the melodrama. King, ah. Little thing that I wanted to point out, there's always a white queen to the black queen. Who is the white queen? The moonchild, sailing on the wind in a milk-white gown. King Crimson has built an entire parallel universe for themselves within this album. The Schizoid Man, the Moonchild, the Black Queen, the Fire Witch, the Crimson King, a medieval hippie settlement on Neptune with swords and lasers and That's in the court of the Crimson King. It had been a long time since I heard this song, and I did quite possibly the whitest thing I've ever done. I clapped when I thought this song was over. Congrats, King Crimson, you landed the plane. Well, I clapped when I thought it was over. King Crimson liked to do this thing where they have this grand ending chord, a pause, and then a little epilogue after, like the curtain call of the record. They did this with the central motif of Court of the Crimson King on Mellotron. This album also has a hidden track tacked on to the end of this song called Dance of MacDonald, Sinfield, and the Puppets. It's less than a minute long. I don't have it on my pressing, so I never heard it until I did my digging for this video. This 20 seconds changes everything. This is how my pressing, and yours too maybe, ends. A great big crescendo that chews us up and spits us back out into reality. And this is the hidden track. When I first heard this, I just about lost my mind. We haven't had a cyclical moment like this on Vinyl Monday yet. Holy shit, this album ends how it starts. There's nothing more human than something cyclical like this, the cycle of war and death and Armageddon and rebirth that King Crimson moves through on Crimson King will go on and on and on until the end of humanity. Robert Fripp once said something like, if prog wants to survive, it has to stop pretending it's 1971. From the outside, one of the reasons prog is so hard to break into is because it's a lot. It's very complex, and some acts fall victim to complexity for complexity's sake. It's pretty obvious when a group does verse, chorus, 10-minute keyboard solo, and sticks in a movement in 16/8 time just for the hell of it. Once you know King Crimson started with all of their stuff in 4/4 time, then built on top of that, you can't unhear it. Having this material grounded in reality, for lack of a better term, is why it's endured so long and remained a paradigm of prog. Though my brain hasn't been tied in knots and kicked down the stairs, I still feel challenged. A lot of prog groups have lost this grounding force along the way. So if we get back to this principle, and then move forward, that's how prog survives. Crimson King's writing totally changed my perspective on prog. Songs about wizards with lasers and venturing into the Green Lagoon for the sacred amulet. It's not for everyone. But here, the stories of exiled soldiers and cruel kings run deeper than that. Crimson King uses fantastical elements to tell a very human story. Creation, preservation, destruction, repeat. It's funny I mentioned that cycle specifically. Hinduism has 3 principal gods for each of those stages: Brahma, Vishnu, and my personal favorite, Shiva. I saw Oppenheimer in the middle of listening to Crimson King for this video. That's a good little time capsule for those of you watching this in the far future. And it was the accidental perfect companion piece. That film was Prometheus giving humans fire, or maybe Pandora opening the box, and in the Court of the Crimson King is the consequences. Man played God, and now we're here. King Crimson and the Court of the Crimson King were wildly ahead of their time. There are some things that date this album, yes, Mellotron, but there are so many more that still sound fresh today. This thing slipped out of my everyday listening, but I feel this will be firmly in the rotation for the foreseeable future. In the Court of the Crimson King is a whopper, so monolithic that even King Crimson themselves couldn't quite escape the cast of its shadow. It was the most forward-thinking album to hit the mainstream in 1969. It dictated how an entire subgenre of music would go for like 10 years after, and it was one hell of a statement of intent from a very green band. In the Court of the Crimson King was rock and roll's quantum leap forward, and it still serves as a compass today. Sorry, Zeppelin, this is the greatest debut album ever released. My personal favorites are... who am I kidding? Since I usually pick 5 or 6 songs as my favorites, and this album is 5 songs, I guess I kind of have to pick the whole thing, but my very favorites are 21st Century Schizoid Man and In the Court of the Crimson King. If you want to keep up with all of the faves from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that is it. That is In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson, and now we only have 3 episodes left of season 2 of Vinyl Monday. What do you think of this one? What do you think of King Crimson? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums I love. And if you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday every Monday morning at 11. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!